You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by James P. Delgado. James P. Delgado is one of the leading figures in marine archaeology, a historian-explorer whose 4 decades of work have reshaped how we understand humanity's past beneath the oceans. Educated at San Francisco State University, East Carolina University, and Simon Fraser University, he went on to become the National Park Service's first maritime historian, where he helped establish national standards for shipwreck preservation. His career has included directing the Vancouver Maritime Museum, leading the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and serving as Director of Maritime Heritage for NOAA, where he advanced deep-sea research, international heritage policy, and telepresence-driven exploration. Across more than 100 expeditions, he has investigated some of the world's most iconic and historically consequential wrecks, from RMS Titanic and the USS Arizona to Kublai Khan's Lost Fleet. A prolific public scholar, he has written over 30 books that combine archaeological rigor with narrative clarity, drawing connections between submerged sites and the broader forces that shaped human history. The Great Museum of the Sea is Delgado's sweeping exploration of the world's oceans as a vast, interconnected archive of human history, where every shipwreck, artifact, and submerged landscape becomes a curated exhibit in the planet's oldest and most expansive museum.
Dr. James Delgado, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, Jim, I have had a long-standing interest in shipwrecks since I was a kid, because I partially, for a few years, grew up on the Oregon coast. And there was a shipwreck sitting there called the Peter Iredale that is in way worse condition today than it was in 1985, but still there. And that fired an interest in shipwrecks. And I have maintained that interest, along with my interest in astrophysics and everything else, to this very day. And you definitely were a central figure in the archaeology of underwater archaeology with ships and shipwrecks. Now, one specific one that has been eating at me to ask you about is a ship that was found many years ago in the Baltic that is perfectly preserved. You know, usually the shipworms eat these things and there's not much wood left, but in the Baltic and the Black Sea and Arctic, they preserve, and you actually have the wood. And we'll get into another perhaps former shipwreck that was raised from that. But the ship in question is called Vrouw Maria, and not only is it preserved, but its cargo is preserved, and was carrying a bunch of paintings from Catherine the Great. She had bought, apparently in our auction, a bunch of old paintings that might still be in that ship. What has happened over the last 20 years regarding that, and is there any plan to go deep into that thing and unload it and look and see what's there?
Well, Vrouw Maria is an amazing shipwreck, and I certainly was there working with colleagues as they dived on it, and we explored it with them back 20 odd years ago, when I was the host of National Geographic's television series The Sea Hunters, with master divers Mike Fletcher and his son Warren. We went out there with a team to join our colleagues who were in the midst of diving on this wreck in the Turku archipelago. Now, Vrouw Maria had been one of those ships that wouldn't have been famous if it hadn't been for the research of some historians that were looking and said, when this merchant died in the Netherlands, this guy, Gert van Brandkamp, had this incredible collection of paintings that went up for auction. And as it turns out, one of the guys who ended up bidding on this was an agent for Catherine the Great, who wanted to add these to her collection at the Hermitage. That would have been a quiet matter if it had not been for the fact that as the ship came into the Baltic and made its way through the Turku archipelago, heading, of course, towards Russia, it struck some rocks. They were busy trying to repair it, and it sank overnight. And with it, this vessel sank to a point where divers could go down. They had the gear to do that even at that stage, but they couldn't really salvage much. Fast forward to this becoming one of the fabled ghost ships in the Baltic, a sea that perfectly preserves wooden vessels in many cases. And finally, thanks to all of this research, the wreck being discovered. Now, the folks there in Finland have been working on it since then. When we visited 20 years ago, I mean, you drop on down through that water, which is brutally cold and dark. That deck is still there, and next to the pumps, which they were working to fix, is the carpenter's toolbox. I mean, it's literally sitting there. She filled with water slowly and just went straight down and landed on the seabed. So you've got that. You've got the masts are tumbled, the ropes are gone, those disintegrate, but the vessel's intact. And when you go underneath the lip of the hatch into the cargo hold, it's packed full of things. Bottles of mineral water that still have the stamps on them from Germany, as I recall. Boxes full of eyeglass, spectacle, lenses, all sorts of other things. And then all the way back past all of these crates is a line of long, narrow crates, which many people interpret as being the paintings that were bound for Catherine the Great. Now, what happened since then is a lot of discussion over how best to deal with this. Would the paintings have survived? Most of the conservators who've really analyzed the question have thought that they might not have. That being said, others have said, well, perhaps we don't know enough. Maybe they sealed them in some way because they were going on an ocean voyage. And there's one thing you can always guarantee about a wooden ship: it leaks. So who's to say? There also was a little bit of back and forth between Finland and Russia, not so much over who owned it, but the rumor at the time was a group of oligarchs wanted to buy the whole thing, raise it, and put it on display in St. Petersburg. The approach taken by the government and the archaeologists was to carefully study it, and then because it's basically sitting not on ice, but certainly in the cold, not much has changed. They monitor it. They were just out not too long ago because I was just meeting with them last week in Europe in a series of meetings on underwater archaeology. So it remains there. No big change since 20 years ago. Probably no big change since a couple hundred years. And if the time is right and the work can be done, and if science can very carefully, and it's only advanced in terms of how we can deal with finds like this, then who knows, maybe in decades to come, we might see one of those lost paintings from the amazing collection of this Dutch collector that was bound to Catherine the Great.
And maybe perhaps just traces of it. If you got the canvas, which I imagine the canvas might survive more than the actual oil paint and such on there, but you might be able to use, techniques to pull out an outline, something like that.
There may be some ghost remnants. What we do see, by the way, is that on other wrecks in the Baltic, for whatever reason, that the dynamics are such that you don't see sailcloth preserved. You don't see clothing generally preserved as well if it's out and exposed. If it's buried in silt, whole other matter. And when the Swedes raised the Vasa from 1626, some of those skeletal remains buried in the hold in the silt were still clothed.
Now, a lot of people are going to ask that question. So Sweden, which as I recall, went all the way up to the king of Sweden at the time, who was an archaeologist. They raised Vasa, a warship from 28.
28,
yes. Yeah, 1628. And they raised it from Stockholm Harbor. And apparently there was some kind of flaw with the design of the thing that caused it to heel and, sink on its maiden voyage. But they were able to bring it up completely intact, along with much of the sculpture and everything that adorned it. And they were able to put it back together. And it's now in a museum in Stockholm, and it's absolutely breathtaking. However, that took years and years and years of impregnating that thing effectively with plastic in order to preserve it. Is archaeology moving towards, especially with like the Baltic, towards the idea of raising and preserving these ships or leaving them in situ? Are they better off in the water where they're at, where they're preserved, or take them out?
Well, it's tough because when you see projects like Vasa or Mary Rose in England, others where entire ships have been raised, the costs are so much. I mean, for every dollar you spend effectively trying to get it out of the water, you're spending at least 10, if not more, times that to take care of it once it comes out, because the preservation that you see from being wet and cold and without a lot of oxygen, that's no longer there. And as you said, Vasa took decades of work and millions upon millions of dollars. And with that, they thought they had it preserved, but then they found out that they hadn't, and they had to go back and preserve it again. So essentially, the rule of thumb for us as archaeologists is if you go to excavate a shipwreck and if you raise it, it's the equivalent not just of, say, adopting or having a kid, it's having a family that's going to last for generations after generations. And you, effectively, as the country, are going to be paying for that. So they have to be particularly special. And with that, I mean, Vasa was raised as a matter of national pride. Portions of the wreck of the U.S. ironclad Monitor were raised as a point of national pride and its significance in the American Civil War. And that's happened, of course, with Henry VIII's warship Mary Rose and others like that. The problem is that in every case where we've seen this happen, it effectively has taken the air out of the room. You don't see much happening then after this in these other countries in terms of major excavations or recoveries because of the ongoing costs of taking care of that which you have raised. So the decision was made in many corners just to set things aside for a while. Also, and as I talk about in the book, there are other groups that have interest in these ships. And with that, one group wanting to see it and put it in a museum may run counter to those who say, well, wait a minute, it's a unique habitat for marine life, or it's a tremendous undersea museum, or it's a grave, and I don't really want to see it raised. I mean, it's for a variety of reasons. Balancing all of that, shipwrecks largely are not coming up these days, though with climate change, with the interruption of natural ecosystems, with marine worms now showing up in areas like the Arctic potentially, as well as the sub-Atlantic, the Baltic, the Black Sea, all of this is changing. So what's being preserved in some of these cases might not always be preserved. So it's time again to have that discussion over, if not this one, what about that one? Where do we go and how do we do this? Some folks are advocating that we simply document them with the latest technology to virtually raise them, though that is an imperfect solution for some. It may be the right one for other wrecks.
Now, with climate change problems like that, and worms, and moving their territory, does it become a matter of rescue archaeology?
Yes.
And I know, for example, with Great Lakes archaeology, there's an invasive clam that was introduced that's creating a lot of problems.
Right.
So do you go down and raise these things because you don't have any choice? You've got to, or it's gone. Is that the situation?
I think it is in some cases. In the Great Lakes, the quagga mussels have certainly attached and they've changed the aesthetic, but doesn't appear that they've been substantially damaging these wrecks. So there, certainly, it's different, but it may not be worse, other than for those who marveled, as I did, to diving on these wrecks where you could still see paint. You could make out a name on a side of a ship going into one. I mean, the furniture was knocked over, but still lying in the captain's cabin, and the man's top hat, much like Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat, was sitting on the deck right next to it. You don't see that these days with some of these wrecks. But one could argue that if you're going to try to raise and rescue something, you would rather go and get something that is going to substantially change our view of history, add something to our understanding of the past, bring lost stories back to life, solve mysteries, perhaps, and be powerful displays in their own right, if in a museum. But again, it's with all the pressing needs, uh, and with rescue archaeology also having to take place on land, I think a very persuasive case has to be made. And so what you see now is many of us going and doing the most comprehensive job we can to document it with the best of the technology available that we have now.
Now, do you use like a? I mean, what is what are the techniques involved in documenting a preserved shipwreck? One that's not so preserved. I would imagine is different if it's a Roman shipwreck or something like that in the Mediterranean versus one that's very well preserved, like Vrouw Maria. I would imagine the preserved one is a lot more complicated. So, what do you use, like laser techniques and things like that, to just get an exact map of everything in situ? Is that the
Right.
way it works?
I mean, when I first started diving on shipwrecks and mapping them, we were stretching mylar tapes underwater and trilaterating and sketching, or taking photos with a film camera and a housing to keep the water out. That's changed and evolved. And what's also changed is that even in shallower waters now, we can use robotic vehicles on a tether. And those remotely operated craft can do an excellent job of holding position, staying. They don't have to decompress. And so you can get a massive amount of imagery captured, as well as three-dimensional imagery, as underwater lidar has evolved. But as well, photogrammetry also works. And so whether you're at 100 meters or at 5,000 meters, that's what many of folks are using now. And we just did that level of documentation with USS Yorktown in about 15,000 feet of water in the Pacific from where it sank during the Battle of Midway.
But even deeper, obviously, I guess, is Titanic, but that's very well documented, and unfortunately, getting damaged. That's an archaeological site that's become a tourist attraction essentially, and it's somewhat different from when Ballard found it back in the 1980s.
Well, the tourism has certainly had an impact, but not as much as people might think. There's ongoing natural processes that happen with these, and what we're beginning to understand the more we find wrecks in deep water is that they change over time. Because first off, when a ship like that sinks, it lands in what is essentially a desert at the bottom of the sea, and with that, marine organisms begin to migrate toward it, and they're feeding on a variety of things, and I'll leave that to the imagination. But more importantly, say with Titanic, bacteria that eat metal show up. And those bacteria, now known largely in the grouping as Titanica halimoni, and there's different species of it, as they eat into that metal, the process of that consumption is an excretion that we see in the form of what's been known as rusticles. And it's basically some of the minerals that form these clouds and cascades and streams of orange and yellow and red that you see streaking on the sides of Titanic. I dived Titanic with the Russians in the Mir 2 submersible in the year 2001. And I was coming up alongside a hull that's still painted black, but with streaks of that rusticle depositing sheen coming down in lumps and been puddling on the seabed and running off into the darkness. That's only increased in the last few decades. Whereas when we were diving, say, Yorktown, sunk in 1942, some rusticles, but still painted. Essentially, give it another few decades, and Yorktown will start to look more like Titanic as ongoing colonization and consumption by the bacteria takes place. So there's that happens. The submersible dives have not done much. I mean, they brushed up against things here and there. And that back in the day, we landed on the wreck thinking that we'd be neutrally buoyant and it wouldn't create a problem, but yet it does, because it changes the equilibrium. Now you're going to have people that will argue, okay, there's that, but then there's the opportunity for people to have come and seen it. And because of all of those dives, Titanic is probably the best documented shipwreck of all. And to the point of those earlier dives, the Russians doing those in the Mirs from the Shirsov Institute, top-notch craft, operated by professionals, and there were mishaps here and there that come from being shoved by current or landing inadvertently, but nothing like I think many people would fear might happen, and certainly nothing along the lines of what happened with Titan, which was the wrong craft being used, um, and to fatal effect. But back to it, Titanic has changed over a while, but the technology's evolved in terms of documenting it. Bob took pictures that were blue and dark when the first camera sleds went over. Coming back in later years, there was better documentation. The 2003, 2004 missions had a big impact in terms of documenting it to a greater degree, beginning to understand what was out there from where the ship had torn apart and scattered wreckage from the ship as well as artifacts. But with that came subsequent missions. I mean, Jim Cameron's missions into Titanic certainly changed our view of that vessel in a very powerful way. And I'm a big fan of James Cameron and what he did to not only share the story in the movie, whether you liked the romance or not. It's a tremendous movie that brings Titanic in a way back to life. And it reminds you that this is a story about people. But to that end as well, Jim's subsequent work and his understanding of Titanic has been immense. In 2010, I was lead scientist on a team that did the first full mapping of Titanic. Now, that cost a lot of money and took a fair amount of time to do it. Most recently, that work has been done much faster and to better, better precision and clarity and in full color. So one could say Titanic has virtually been raised.
And also, one thing James Cameron did with his documentary specifically was that he went into the Turkish bath, and a lot of stuff was still there, and that was rather amazing.
Yeah.
But he's done a whole lot of other stuff as far as undersea exploration. Not just a movie director. There's
Absolutely
a lot more there.
No,
Now, yeah,
he's a great explorer.
absolutely. Now, back to the Baltic.
Mm-hmm.
And Vrouw Maria is not the only ship there. There's things like multiple Swedish warships that exploded, and all of the stuff that's down there preserved, at least in the northern part of it. But what are we missing? Is there a holy grail of not yet discovered ships that might be perfectly preserved in the Baltic?
I think it'd be awesome to find some of the earliest ships. I mean, we're seeing some trace of these early Scandinavian vessels that initially were revealed to us through burials of those boats in grave mounds ashore. Finding a Viking ship that sank while crossing with the shield still there and all the other elements and what may have been inside, I think would be an amazing discovery. We know a great deal about Viking craft because of excavations on land, including the ones scuttled at Roskilde and now in the museum there, and likewise other craft. I think that those are the important ones. But coming back to the idea of a holy grail, I think where I find the more significant wrecks these days lie are those that have connections to families and to people that may not be famous, but they mean something to these folks, whether it's to a community or to a nation, or if it's to a family. Ships sail away and they disappear and nothing's ever heard, or a boat is found, or a body washes ashore, or literally a note in a bottle. Many of those cases, I think, are the ones that strike me more and more as less of the push for a celebrity wreck, as much as wrecks that come back to the fundamental question that faces any and all of us who go to sea and work. And that is, you get to go. You don't have a guarantee that you can come back. And that profound aspect of seafaring that goes back tens of thousands of years, I think is perhaps one of the most important things where archaeology can shed light. And I also say that as somebody who's participated in missions, both older vessels, but also more recent ones where we either sought to do that or were successful in doing that and answering questions and bringing closure to families.
Now, protecting shipwrecks, underwater archaeology and protecting it, that has to be a daunting, unbelievably daunting task. And I know that some of the World War II wrecks have been basically scrapped on the seafloor and, damaged or in some cases completely disappeared. And, they find remains, they're war graves. They find remains and bury them in Indonesia or somewhere. But how hard is that? How hard is it to protect what's there so that we at least have it, if not raise it?
I think it's very difficult to protect. I mean, you can protect to a certain point, but what I found years ago when I first worked as a park ranger is people protect that which they cherish or they feel is important. But not everybody agrees. And that's one of the points I tried to make in the book is we all have our views of shipwrecks. I've been fortunate to have been a government policy person, to have been a field archaeologist, to have been a museum director, to be a television person, to write, to do all of that. And so I can see the different perspectives. Trying to balance those can be very difficult. And as we know, politics is imperfect. So politicians who seek to balance these things, you can't come up with the perfect law or the perfect answer. You just do the best you can. World War II wrecks are being scrapped, in particular in the Pacific, and everybody knows who's doing it and has a certain level of understanding as to why it's being done. And I think it's not just a question of pre-atomic era steel for its value in medical instruments and the like. I think it's also a means of cleaning up a no longer desired past, particularly for nations that seek to assert their own sovereignty or return to an understanding of a past that focuses on them, not those who came. I don't agree with that because I think that all history is important. And even if you don't like that history, it's not yours to erase. It's yours to use as a means of reflection and maybe, I think the word teaching moment is overused, but certainly as something that gets people to having a discussion about it. If you wiped out every bit of evidence over a wrong, then you have effectively, in a way, said that that wrong was okay. And I have a problem with that. In other cases, you have people that are literally doing things with some of these shipwrecks because it's the only way they have of making money. Many years ago in Vietnam, with my colleague George Belcher, we were in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, and we got word that an ancient boat had been found way up the Mekong in an area that nobody went to, small community of sand dredgers. They basically were making their money by dredging up sand and selling it down the river for construction projects. So we made our way all the way up there to find that that boat was gone. It had been raised by these guys, and sure, it was ancient history. It was from the Dongsan period, over close to a millennia old, as I recollect. And yet, everything that had been in that boat burial, they just dumped the bones back into the river because it was used as a burial site. Jade and bronzes that had been saved had been sold at first to one dealer who made their way there and picked up a few things, and another came. There were just a handful of things left. The boat itself was of no value, but the wood was still good. So when we got there, it had been cut up and had been used to make a pen for some of the local animals in the community. As to what happened to that stuff, some of the material just went, the best of it ended up in a certain large city in the hands of a very large auction company. The rest of it we saw in an antique store on Lee Kung Keo Street in Saigon. These things happen, and you can't fight that. You can try to deal with it in a variety of ways, but in the suite of the world's problems and needs, oftentimes shipwrecks don't rate or manage. Um, you ultimately, what you end up having to do is defer to the wishes of the people around whom or who live around or are associated with these things. I haven't worked on a project yet where in some way or another we're not in somebody's backyard or in their community, whether it's literally on the shores of their bay or in that river by their town or in that lake, or their community means that it comes from their town, their state, or they have family members on a ship that's sitting at the bottom of the ocean, even 1,000 miles away. They're the ones that can advocate the best. But again, you can't protect everything. And out of the 2 million or more shipwrecks that sit at the bottom, we just can't save them all, which is why some people like I and others have tried to do is to go out, find them, document them, learn as much as we can.
Now, regarding the preservation of shipwrecks, when you destroy one, you're also depriving the future, future archaeologists and historians and the general public from it. But at the same time, it also is good for tourism in a way because you've got diving, you've got museums, things like that, preserved artifacts, especially with the really old ones, so 1,000 years old and things like that. But give me, in accordance with your book, The Great Museum of the Sea by Dr. James Delgado. Jim, yep, absolutely. Now tell me, what is your view as a very long time archaeologist working with shipwrecks? What is the importance of underwater archaeology?
I think underwater archaeology gives us a chance to add more to the story. Underwater archaeology, maritime archaeology studies that specific aspect of the past. And while it's focused in part on ships or what ships carry, what it's really looking at is people. And in some cases, whether it's the more modern past or the ancient past, it connects us to those people and to those lives. We may not know their names, or we may know the culture with whom a shipwreck was associated. Um, And in that, I think what we begin to understand is the role, and what I've seen in that great museum of the sea with the wrecks that we've studied and the things that have been excavated and raised, is a growing understanding of the modern world in which we live, emerged entirely from the interconnections this planet had discovered once people took to sea. What we now suspect, and it would be nice to find the remains of such a craft, is there's evidence that is compelling just in terms of transmission of stones, but also ancient peoples that say that potentially people were taking to some form of watercraft tens of thousands of years ago. And why do we not see more of these? Probably because those watercraft were sophisticated and sleek and as seemingly simple as yet so complicated as the modern version, and by modern I mean the last 1,000 years, that we see exemplified in the Polynesian canoe. From that to more modern ships, what archaeology does is not only takes us back to that aspect of the oceans as the means by which humanity spread around the globe, waged war, defended itself, traded, and harvested, with 90% of the world's food coming from the sea at any given time, even now. Maritime archaeology helps add detail to that. It brings to mind stories long forgotten or never known because a ship sank well off of sight of shore and nobody knew what happened. It reminds us that our ancestors were neither fools nor afraid. They boldly went. And in that spirit of exploration, as well as what's beyond the horizon and far off when you're sailing on an ocean with no sight of land, their ability to navigate, something that we marvel at the Polynesians doing, but I think these ancient peoples did it too. I think is a reminder of, particularly when things are tough, of what we are capable of as humanity.
But how far did they go? Is there any evidence? For example, a lot of people talk about contact between North America and Europe, Africa, etc. Is there any archaeological evidence on the seafloor that we found so far that suggested that maybe a Roman galley or something like that drifted, you know, everybody's dead on it and ended up, in the Gulf of Mexico or something like that? Have we ever found anomalies like that?
Nothing definitive. What we have is a fair amount of evidence. I mean, and people that have read those books know there's all sorts of anecdotal stories of other people who came from the past, and the whole question of cross-cultural contact, um, whether it's transatlantic, trans-Pacific. Uh, no shipwrecks yet, though some interesting stories. Do I think it happened? Yeah, I do. Did it happen all the time? Who's to say? We don't have an idea of frequency, but if modern examples suggest, just based on the accounts of European explorers coming in over the last 500 years and our own understanding of ocean currents and drift, you could certainly drift. I mean, and Thor Heyerdahl famously proved that, with drift voyages as well as sailing. But I think they didn't just drift. I think people were capable of surviving and moving across the water. In some cases, if it's a Polynesian voyaging canoe type of craft, you're not going to see anything. And finding a simple artifact, simple and yet complex, like a poi pounder, for example, in a Polynesian canoe at 10,000 feet in the sediment, is going to be difficult. It's far easier to find a more modern wreck. And even then, we can't find them all unless it's a very systematic and expensive survey. That being said, what we rely on now, for the most part, is evidence of what we see ashore. And to that end, increasingly, I mean, long before Japan opened to the Western world, we know that others were showing up there. There was regular trade back and forth between Asia and Japan. And when the Mongols came to attack in the 12th century, they certainly sailed across. Spanish and Portuguese came, the Dutch came, everybody sailed, the English to Japan. We also have some sense that seafarers were crossing from the South American mainland over to Easter Island, because now DNA has shown up that shows that level of contact with certain finds. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm meandering a bit here because that's a whole other podcast discussion. But it happened. I'd like to see some more evidence of it in terms of a ship or a shipwreck, but in due time. I mean, we've only mapped, a portion of the ocean bed and basically the shallow edge of the bathtub close to the shore. There's a lot of stuff that's out there in deep water, and at some stage, I think a number of us have been expecting we will see somewhere out there. Somebody's going to say, are those amphora halfway across the Atlantic or coming right up off the coast in 3,000 feet of water? And hey, man, we're off the coast of Mexico. And is that a Greek wreck? Could happen. Might happen. I'd like to be around if it does.
Well, I think what fires my imagination about that idea is if you look at the peoples of the Pacific, if you can make it to New Zealand and colonize New Zealand from however far away in Polynesia, and you can make it to Hawaii, and many, many long ago, people can make it to Australia. Mm-hmm. They could probably make it to California.
Of course they could. Of course they could, particularly if you're able to harvest the sea. To that end, I think now what we're beginning to understand to a better level of detail is that the peopling of the Americas did have a maritime component. They didn't just walk following a mammoth. They took to the water. And whether it's an umiak or kayaks, and they're coming across, either following the ice or following the exposed land, anybody that lives close to a seashore knows, and the First Nations in British Columbia told me this a long time ago. When the tide goes down, the table is set. You can You can harvest marine life, from tide pools, down barnacles and other mollusks sticking to those rocks, and you have a meal. Build a fire and steam it under some seaweed, and you've got a very nutritious meal, and with a high possibility of then making it all the way, touching and going. That's a lot easier than chasing a mammoth and bringing him down and then trying to haul all that meat.
Whole lot of fish in that area. The Bering Strait, a huge fishery today, and probably was even better then.
Yes.
And if you knew how to do that, then there you go. And I remember there was the story of St. Brendan from Ireland coming across the other way. And they would have had to have done that in that skin boat that they were using, very, very tiny skin boat. And so I think that perhaps it should be taken more seriously that contact was, it was probably happening.
They just dug up a woman's skeleton in Scandinavia, as I recollect. I'd have to go back and look at the story. But she had Native American DNA. Of course, they talk about Skraeling. The Vikings settling, and I've been to some of those settlement sites on the coast of Greenland. There's Viking boat rivets on appropriately named Skraeling Island off the northwest coast of Greenland. I mean, people got around.
That was half. That's what humans do. We move around. Now, preserved oceanic shipwrecks or not so preserved oceanic shipwrecks versus, and this gets back to preservation briefly, versus ones that never sank. We have HMS Victory and USS Constitution that never sank and have just been preserved this whole time, but they become sort of like the ship of Theseus, where they are constantly being replaced with new timbers and things like that. And you look at Victory, it's always, there's always work going on to keep that going. Now, those ships, though, you can do it because they never sank, but with Vasa, you can't replace timber. So preservation of a raised shipwreck versus a preserved shipwreck. Give us a profile of that.
Well, maritime writer and historian Alan Villiers once said succinctly, all ships in time either become a wreck or a replica, as you've said. So I've worked on both. Earlier in my career, I oversaw the Maritime Preservation Program for the United States, and with that, visited every preserved historic ship in the country at the request of the Congress to figure out which ones were the most important, which ones needed help, how to best try to line up help for some of those folks, whether it be government or other means, and in some cases, basically, to say these are the most important because of the following historical reasons that fit within the existing laws. And so with that, I looked at a lot of them. The metal ships is a little different. They can stay together for much longer. Wooden ships in time ultimately are rebuilt. Old Ironsides, I've been there for at least one of those. Victory is constantly being rebuilt. The historic ships that I first worked on in San Francisco, at San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park, then the Maritime Museum, they're built to softwood. Dry rot takes its toll. So they are substantially rebuilt. It's not the same ship that I first knew back in 1979 when I first stepped on board and began interpreting it. It is what it is. What I like about historic shipwrecks is that you do have that sense of you're in that space. It is somewhat timeless, even if it is deteriorating. And I'll come back to Vasa, for example. When I was there on one occasion, my colleagues took me on board and I was able to take a tour. And one of the more unique points in that tour was going into the small cockpit where the helmsman had been steering Vasa with that whipstaff. And my colleague Fred Hawker said, This is unlike any other historic building or structure you've ever been in. Very few people have come in here since 1628. Uh, at this moment, without a lot of change, because nothing's been replaced, you were literally surrounded by the 17th century.
I've seen a photograph of that room, and it looks like the only thing that the helmsman that was moving that whatever, rudder or whatever it wasn't a wheel. It was
No,
they were just pushing it.
It's a staff. It basically is pulling this pole back and forth to steer. Yeah.
I wonder how many people you needed to do that, because I mean, did you just need one? Was it that easy, or was it like no power steering? You needed multiple people.
They had their version of power steering. The one thing, that I'm always fond of saying is that we tend to look at people in the past and think they just weren't as smart or they didn't have the tech. They had tech. They just didn't have all the tech we have. And I mean, look, we're finding boilers for heating water in Roman houses that have survived, certainly in Pompeii and elsewhere. These guys, they had blocks and tackle and pulley. They knew how to do that and how to calculate the ratios to add more power. Basically, that helmsman was found inside that wreck. Once they raised it and excavated silt out of there, when the ship had sunk, that staff had whipped and thrown him against a bulkhead, and whether he was unconscious or died when he struck, his body was found there crumpled, still wearing his clothing, but skeletal in that mud as they excavated him. A very powerfully built man, and as I recall, a hunchback.
I wonder if that was because of the helm, manning the helm for long term, because that can affect the bones.
It could be, but this guy had power. I mean, you could tell from the morphological changes to his bones, from the repetitive strain and the exercise, that this was one strong human being.
Now, how did that work? As I recall, the only openings in there were two deck doors leading out to one of the decks. I don't know which one. Were they just yelling orders to the guy, hard to port, and things like that, and he couldn't actually even see anything? Is that how that worked?
Had to have been. I mean, basically, if you have somebody up there and they're saying, and it's likely it's going to be, I'm sure he had to have something there so he could tell which graduate. They're not going to say yank it to the left or yank it to the right. They're probably going to say, starboard 12 degrees, basically some command like that. He's going to do that as well because they're aware of the circumstances. They're a trained crew. They've built an appropriate amount of time in for anything other than a last minute, oh God. And certainly that was the case when suddenly she heeled over and went down, flooded, and took all those folks with them.
Yeah, and the other thing is, as I recall with Vasa, they had the gun ports open, which just made it worse. And the fact that you're carrying an enormous weight of cannons. And as I remember, some of those were salvaged back during the period with diving bells and things like that. And they salvaged some, but there were some they didn't find. But the majority of the ship was there. However, even though the wood was preserved, the iron wasn't. So they had to stabilize that thing to bring it up and get it up on a barge, basically.
Yes.
So is there any place on Earth, and I would be skeptical that there is, where iron like that preserves indefinitely with wood? Is there's just nothing that can stop a rusticle, right? They just live in all environments. Is that correct?
Well, I think what happens is over time, I mean, it will break down and degrade. All things go. Nothing will be preserved forever. I mean, we have yet to really go back and recover anything that's been in geosynchronous orbit for decades since the dawn of the space age to just see what the effects are on those materials up there. We've got the Apollo 8 module in geosynchronous orbit with us. What kind of shape is that in right now? Ultimately, it is the way of all things to go. which comes back to why when we do the work we do, in many cases, if we're the first there, it's that Howard Carter moment of you open that tomb and there it all is. Your responsibility is to document it as completely as you can before you touch a thing. And that's where I think the work that our colleagues in Canada are doing with the Franklin ships, with the Erebus and the Terror, these ships are time capsules. You've got drawers with books in them. You've got a brush with the guy's hair still caught in the bristles. You've got uniforms hanging. Document it all before you take anything, because the moment, let's say you try to take something out of that drawer, the whole thing falls apart and you lose it. Better to slowly, carefully, bit by bit do it, if you've got the time and you've got the money.
Now, with the Franklin expedition, the very ill-fated Franklin expedition, those ships were recently discovered, relatively recently, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and they are perfectly preserved in the Arctic. Different, for the same reason, no ship-boring worms, but they also have problems with like ice. As I remember, Erebus's stern is damaged, but Terror is basically perfect, and which that's an amazing ship because it had a long history back to the War of 1812. Before that, as a bomb ship, and it was, they were built very stoutly to hold those carronades and things like that to shoot the bombs bursting in air, actually, as Francis Scott Key had said in the song. And it's perfect. And not only that, it's perfect to the point that there are bottles still sitting on shelves.
Oh, yeah.
Does that tell you, as an archaeologist, that Franklin expedition ship sank basically, boom,
yes,
and that's it, and that there was just no disruption to the interior of this thing, and that everything is exactly preserved from that very horrible expedition that no one survived from?
Yeah, I mean, when Franklin and his crews set out in Erebus and Terror in 1845, they were the best equipped, competently led expedition with the goal of making their way through to close the last link in decades of British exploration to find a sea route across the top of the world to the Northwest Passage. Last sighted when speaking to whalers in Baffin Bay, they said to write to them care of Russia within the next year. But instead, they were caught in a bad ice year and stuck. They got as far as Beechey Island and then ultimately came down and stranded off of the north of King William Island. Deaths began to happen. Cold, illness, lead-tainted food has been suggested as another means of loss, just given the fact that early canning technology was not perfect. And so, ultimately, the ships, unable to leave, with these guys wearing out their rations, had to take to land to try to walk out. For years, many of us thought that perhaps they had just stumbled along the way and died, because earlier than some of our expeditions, searchers seeking Franklin had found relics had spoken to the Inuit. Dr. John Ray, fur trader, had retrieved artifacts from the Inuit, including one of Sir John Franklin's medals, his Hanoverian Order of Guelph. Excuse me. So, with all of this, I mean, Francis Leopold McClintock in the Fox in 1859 famously finds a cairn with the last note, April 25th, 1848. Franklin is dead. The ships have been abandoned, and they're starting now for Back's Great Fish River. He follows in that and finds bodies, now skeletal, some still with elements of their blue Melton cloth uniforms stuck to their bones. One of those guys, captain of the foretop, I think of Terror, Harry Pegler, still had his notebook in his front pocket, frozen to the tundra. And I've held it in my hands. It's now at Greenwich. And the last note in pencil is appropriately Shakespearean. "Oh, death, where is thy sting?" That's what the guy wrote. So that, a boat full of skeletons with one guy with a rifle close by, perhaps to keep the bears away. Traces of some of those camps being evident, strongly evident, not just despair, but of cannibalism. All of that just played out. It was a prolonged horror story that became part of the lore and legend of the Arctic. I mean, they painted paintings, they wrote books, they did plays. Charles Dickens grew his beard, for God's sakes, to portray an Arctic explorer in one of those. Wilkie Collins wrote. I mean, so you've got all of that. But where were the ships? When they were found because the people that lived there had seen it all. And I find it highly ironic and fun. Having myself sailed right by in a Canadian icebreaker, it's lying in a bay that basically, in Inuktitut, says Shipwreck Bay. So, okay. The Inuit saw everything that happened, but these Kabluna were crazy. They were killing each other, and they couldn't take all of these guys in. An average Inuit hunter at that time would have to work over a few square miles just to get enough food to bring home for his family, and maybe not enough. So what played out, played out. The ships, when found, were an incredible find. And I think it's important that they're there and that they're studied. The lessons to be learned, I think, were learned many years ago just through prudent historical research. And with that, I think perhaps one of the most profound things that's come out of the whole discovery is, again, it's in somebody's backyard. In this case, the Inuit there in those communities, particularly off King William Island. It's their story to tell as much as anybody else's. The wrecks are going to stay there. Some artifacts are already on display. Tourism is playing a role, though nobody can go and dive on these wrecks because they're such time capsules. But the stories that are now coming out increasingly have been more of the story of these expeditions, not understanding the Arctic, and a fruitless quest back then. Northwest Passage these days, a whole other story, because the ancient dream of a route across the top of the world and cutting the time off to get between Europe and Asia, that's going to happen. There's going to be an ice-free Arctic in the summer within the next decade. So, yes, but those wrecks, amazing.
Amazing. And I often wonder what the Inuit thought. They're like about the Franklin expedition, watching these Englishmen running around with their like chickens with their head cut off and lead poisoned from the canned goods. The Inuit must have been like, these people are ill prepared. Not only that, but they are crazy. And I wonder what I would love to talk to an Inuit from that period and ask them, what did you see with those people? The Franklin expedition.
Well, having talked to some of the descendants of the people that were there, they were definitely thinking that back then, and that carried on to this day. And with that, there were certain people who were keepers of memory who knew where those ships were.
Oh, they did. And they kept saying where terror was. And they kept looking all over in the wrong place. And they're like, no, the ship is in Terror Bay that's named after it. And we've known the whole time. And in fact, I think that there was a story I read anyway about terror or either Erebus or Terror, where the Inuit went on there and there was a guy dying, at the time. And they were just, grabbing copper or whatever they were looking for, or just to look around. Yeah. And that they actually might have been the last people to see someone from that expedition, and he was just laying in bed dying.
Yeah. Well, and then you hear accounts of lone individuals still making their way out as late as, early 1850s, but not getting all the way home. I've often thought, here you are, and everybody else is gone, and you're left. Your clothing is freezing around you because it's blue wool. It's damp, you're sweating, it's starting to freeze. Your boots are wearing out, your feet are blistered. You're wearing eyeglasses, and finally you stumble, and those eyeglasses come off and shatter on the rocks, and you can't see clearly, you're cold, you're worn out, and you just sit down and slowly fall asleep. And I just know how that must be. And I think that's exactly what happened to Harry Pegler, for example. That guy was just found lying face down, probably curled up, and went to sleep.
Well, that's what happens with the people that don't make it when they climb Mount Everest. They just
Yeah.
you get hypothermia and fall asleep, and that's that. And you just you don't wake up. You don't wake up, and you can't really be woke up. Now, in regards to preservation of shipwrecks in general, there's one place that we haven't talked about yet, which is the Black Sea, which is a different environment. It's not cold, it's anoxic.
Right.
And there are shipwrecks down there that could be very, very old. And, for all we know, ancient Greek ships and all that. And they could be preserved to the extent that some people have said might even have preserved human remains on them and all these things. And we don't really know anywhere near where these shipwrecks are. You just have to run across them. And we found some, and they're from all different periods. But do you expect that to be the hotbed for underwater archaeology in the coming decades?
It is a hotbed in a way, and I don't just mean given what's happening in terms of the war, but one ancient Greek wreck was found, and incredibly matches what you see on the side of an amphora. There are wrecks that I've not seen in the Black Sea, but colleagues have that do have human remains. But I'm talking about bones here and there. I mean, you see those in other sites, but definitely there's a few of those. I just saw a group of papers about a squadron of ships that was sailing across together and sank, all basically in the same bad weather event in as I recall, the early 18th century. So it is in its own way this incredible museum of very well preserved ships. The environmental conditions are changing there as well, as I understand it. And so it may be that the Black Sea will also face some of these challenges in terms of ongoing preservation. But I will say that in one case, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, founded by George Basson, with brilliant archaeologists working, excavated a series of wrecks off the coast of Turkey. And from very fragmentary remains, were able at different sites to give us a sense of some of these ancient craft. Fast forward to one of these Byzantine wrecks where fragments had been found and a great deal had been intuited, and how wonderful it was for all of those archaeologists then with the Ballard missions to see more or less a completely intact one. All in all, mast still standing and going, I guess we got it right. And hey, what about that detail? That's the power of a site like that.
Now, what about Asia? And, wrecks from Japan or China and things like that, because they have that very long fishing tradition and naval traditions and things like that. Is there other areas, for example, up in the Bering Strait again, that might preserve some off course wreck or some fisherman that was going way out there that we might find preserved? Are there other areas where shipwreck preservation can happen perfectly like this?
Well, one of the places where it happens is if you get something that comes in close to shore or on a beach area that's covered in silt or sand. Some of the earliest boats, sewn boats in the Philippines and elsewhere, in Sri Lanka, sites like that have been found that include wrecks that speak not just to the Asian seafaring tradition, but the fact that as inheritors of the ancient seafaring traditions, the Arabs were sailing into Asia and trading. The Prophet Muhammad has a relative who's buried in China from that time period. So whether it's the Indianized civilizations coming in and settling on the coasts of what's to now Vietnam, and those groups and their seafaring traditions, to the Arabs, to the fusion of those shipbuilding techniques as seen with a wreck found of the Belatongue wreck, which very much embodies the form of the types of vessels you see still being made in the traditional way in the Gulf of Oman. You've got that, but then you've got ancient Asian craft. Scholars there in China, in Japan, and Korea have really started to learn more about those, and I was fortunate to be able to work with the Japanese a bit on the wrecks from Kublai Khan's invasion of Japan in 1281, where this large fleet came over. Most of these were actually Chinese-built vessels, some from Korea, The Chinese vessels were from the previously um, from the previous government before the Mongols took over, the Song dynasty, and their warships and their craft had been taken into the Mongols' navy, and that the Mongols are horseback guys, right? So they need the Chinese to run their navy for them, though they have some of their fighters on board the ships. The remains of the vessels reveal a great deal about the sophistication of that seafaring at the time, as well as the weapons. But again, for me, the human factor was we were diving on one in Okazaki, in the bay there, and you saw the skeletal remains of one of these guys, and he was on the seabed and just scattered bones, but laminar armor made of leather just coming apart like fish scales all around him, bright red. Um, a set of crossbow bolts that he'd probably carried lying near him, his sword, his helmet, and then his bowl, which in written on it was his rank, centurion, and his name, which was Wang. And that guy face down in the mud as a skeleton was an amazing reminder. Again, for me, ships and parts and the artifacts are an aspect of it, but it's ultimately people. So, yeah, there's a great deal that's happening in Asia, including up to the modern times. There's less interest, more and more, in what's happened in terms of the colonial period, and especially with World War II. The largest view, I think, that's now prevalent out there is that the World War II wrecks represent, for some, something to encourage tourism, but more often than not, full of oil still and explosives, toxic legacies from that last century and that war.
Yeah, very unfortunate. And that, I mean, they're still digging up, bombs that didn't go off in Europe and things like that. But with something like that kind of an archaeological site, you don't just find bones, anonymous bones. You have a name on a bowl, and you can, start to try to reconstruct at least the very last moments of the man's life. And I definitely would not want to be in the water wearing armor. That might have contributed to that.
Yeah. Well, what's hard to say is whether or not this ship sank as part of a large typhoon, thanks to the emperor praying to the gods at Ise shrine and a divine wind being delivered, or just a seasonal typhoon, or as one of the scrolls, Takazaki Suenaga's scroll that's at the Palace Museum in Tokyo, depicts his deeds of valor in just boarding these ships and cutting off heads, or scuttling these ships or setting them on fire. I remember floating over and looking at Wang and wondering if he'd ever thought that, centuries later, somebody would be hovering over him and wondering who he was and what his story was. The analysis of his bones, by the way, shows that he was Chinese and came from the Guangzhou area.
So, what do the bones say about that man? Do they show a hard life? Do they show a life of a soldier? Essentially, what do they show?
It's been a long time. What I do remember, one, is that I think he was young, roughly about 19. He had clearly been born into that life. I mean, and as terms of injuries or other, evidence of repetitive stress, things of that sort, that I don't recall, other than in a very short life, which probably was marked with a lot of combat. Bear in mind, this guy's coming of age at a time when the Mongols have invaded Song China, and they're winning, and they take it over. And this guy now serves a new emperor and a new group. He'd seen a lot in his short life, and that life ended on the shores of a foreign land, locked, I think, in pretty intense combat.
Now, what of folklore? We know that, as we were talking about cross migration, and we know the Vikings did it. We have Ainsall Meadows and places like that show that the Vikings did have a presence in North America, and vice versa. But what about folk tales? Are there folk tales where someone meets someone that is clearly not from their part of the world. Is there anything preserved in any folklore that suggests contact in and of itself, independent of archaeology?
There are, but that's not an area that I've really taken a look at. So, with that, I'm going to be a very honest scholar and say I really don't know.
It'd be fascinating because I mean, obviously with the Franklin expedition, which is a lot newer,
Oh, yeah.
they it wasn't just folk tales. There's stories. They're like, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
this was bad.
No, and they had names for specific explorers whom they'd met on previous expeditions. I mean, Crozier, many of these guys had come from earlier expeditions. Um, no, I mean, there are some strong stories coming out of the Arctic from the Inuit testimony, and whether it's Schwatka or Hall or other people that have been interviewing people up there in the Arctic and getting these stories, there's a sense of, okay, they're talking, we think Agluka is this officer. So there is that. But other than that, elsewhere, uh, it's not been one of those areas I've looked into.
Now, Erebus and Terror had a previous expedition and mapped Antarctica with John Ross.
Yeah.
And there's, as a matter of fact, there's mountains, volcanoes named after them in Antarctica. But Antarctica also preserves shipwrecks, and one of those is HMS, or not HMS, but Endurance.
Right.
The ship Endurance, where we found, I mean, you can see the wheel of the ship is preserved.
Yeah.
And tell us about that. What else could be in Antarctica, or is that going to be basically very little? Is that going to be slim pickings as far as underwater archaeology, and Endurance is probably all you're going to find because no one went there?
But there's other wrecks up there, but they're the less glamorous types. Actually, the most common type of shipwreck in the world are fishing craft. And with that, back in the day, particularly given the global spread of it, whaling ships. There are a large number of whaling shipwrecks in the Arctic. I know we did a project where we looked at a fleet of them that had been crushed and caught in the ice. Um, the same is true down there. Sealing and whaling took place, and so a number of those wrecks that are there in Antarctica, Antarctic waters, and then up into other areas of the South Atlantic really reflect that history. Um, Not much in the way of voyages of exploration. The quest for the Northwest Passage and then the North Pole is the one that really ate ships and ate lives, as opposed to, you know, the others. I think what sets Endurance apart, one, is the incredible preservation of that ship at the bottom of the world, but two, as well, the incredible human story. And again, let's not forget that the most powerful stories we tell are stories about ourselves as people. And when you look at that expedition and what they endured, when you look at the exceptional leadership of Ernest Shackleton and that voyage in James Caird, I have sailed those waters. Yes.
I don't know that I would want to be in a wooden sailing ship and taking that on, but they did. And sometimes their shacks and things like that are preserved in
Oh, yeah.
Antarctica and preserved very well, basically as they were left with those Arctic expeditions. What I would like, though, and I'll admit this, I would like a real mystery where you find, Polynesian boat or something down there, or something like that you just you didn't think you would find. And, maybe it was just, a ghost ship. But about ghost ships, you did work with probably the most famous ghost ship in history, the Mary Celeste. What's left there and what did you find?
Well, Mary Celeste, is one of those stories that, excites a lot of interest because here's the vessel found, sails flapping, no nary a soul on board. Not food still on the table, things of that sort. The ship had been abandoned quickly, and there was a trailing line at the stern that suggests that they'd let themselves off in a small boat. Everything from the Bermuda Triangle to murder to, deliberate, barratry by the captain. They're going to try to scuttle it, and something goes wrong. Who knows what happened, other than the various theories ultimately revolve around a cargo that they were afraid might burst into flame or explode. And so they got into a small boat, and there weren't that many of them, and it includes his wife and child and the line parts, something of that sort, and the ship keeps going because they had the sails loosely set, and they're just left there to drift until they finally go, and no trace to be found. When the ship is found, of course, it excites all sorts of interest, and it's not the only one. There are lots of ghost ships. This one just happens to catch a lot of attention, and it transitions into popular literature, particularly with a fictional account of the vessel having been caught up and everybody being murdered, and the confession of one of these guys, the tale of, what is it, J. Habakkuk Brown, I think. Anyway, the vessel itself discovered, brought into court, brought to Malta, and adjudicated under Admiralty law, and then sold to the benefit of those who'd rescued it. Returned to trade. It was rebuilt and repaired over time, and ultimately ended its days sailing into Haiti on a deliberate voyage of destruction. The captain had loaded it with an insured cargo that basically was full of like rotten pet food and musty shoes and all sorts of other junk, and he scuttled it off of Rochelas Reef. The site of the wreck, and it was the only wreck known to have happened in this bay, became a settlement for local conch fishermen. And to this day, there's an island that these people live on that's made up of generations of conch shells, where they perch there at the edge of the sea. There's been some discussion as to whether or not the wreck in question was Mary Celeste, and I think that comes from the fact that the wreck was sought by Clive Cussler. And Clive did a great deal in his time, not just in terms of writing some amazing and outrageously fun books, but also in putting his money back into trying to find ships that had a history. I was fortunate enough to be the archaeologist who worked with Clive, not in the field. He had a great team of colleagues, and Ralph and Wes are good friends. Wes is no longer with us, nor is Clyde, but I was the archaeologist that he picked to be the archaeologist and the host of the TV series he did with National Geographic, with master divers Mike and Warren Fletcher, and an amazing team, including my good friend, the producer and director of that, the late John Davis. One of the wrecks Clive wanted to find was Mary Celeste. So going there, doing the research, going to the insurance records, the captain was very explicit as to where he'd done this. And they went out and went to the wreck, which had been set on fire, but still were able to find persuasive evidence of the insurance fraud that had led to the captain being charged with and convicted of barratry. Though barratry, or the destruction of your own ship, can be punishable by death, he avoided that. Anyway, the locals said, only one wreck, here it is. It's the only wreck charted. So Clive and the others, they went, they looked at it. I was not there for those dives, but they dived, recovered a number of fittings, and I got all of those back with the blessing of the Haitian authorities to analyze them. And everything we found was consistent. The size of the wreck on the seabed was consistent with Mary Celeste, including the beam, or the length. Beam ratio is important. So the length, the beam, or the breadth of the width, that all came very close. The type of fasteners, the type of sheathing, that was a Muntz metal, a later naval brass, down to the wood, all matched. What unfortunately happened, and I think it's very unfortunate, is a fellow that, and I'm not going to name names, who was very upset with Clive, didn't, and wanted to be part of the story but couldn't, decided he would make his bones, if you will, with the bones of the wreck by getting a couple of the samples that had come back and asking for an analysis. The analysis showed that some of this wood was basically southern yellow pine. He said, well, it can't be Mary Celeste because she was built in Nova Scotia, and we've got a couple of woods here that would come from Nova Scotia, but not southern yellow pine. The simple fact of the matter is Mary Celeste had been rebuilt in large measure, and the planks that you replace with southern yellow pine are either going to be the ceiling planks or the outer hull planks, which is what these fragments were from. Therein lies the risk if you then, you go with some knowledge, but a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. If you know how much of southern yellow pine is being harvested at that time and from first growth forests shipped to shipbuilding centers like New York and elsewhere where she was rebuilt, it makes sense. The other part, though, that was unconscionable is that he got a fellow to do tree ring analysis and to figure out when was this tree cut. What we learned later is he said, no, it couldn't have been cut. It came from a later time period. This tree was cut after Mary Celeste was lost. What later was confessed was that they had only fragments. So what the guy did was 3 fragments, not even sure they were from the same plank, was basically superimpose them to come up with the tree ring count. So it's as if he took 3 different trees to make one full sequence. And so the results are absolutely scientifically wrong. Clive Cussler and their team found Mary Celeste and did the right thing. Those artifacts are now back in Haiti. But unfortunately for Clive, at least out there, and I see it on Wikipedia, there are some people who suggest that no, Cussler didn't find that. Sorry, Cussler haters, he did. I was privileged to be able to work with the guy, and while he had an outrageous sense of humor and sometimes was swashbuckling.
Swashbuckling, you say?
Swashbuckling. But he would not lie, and he was absolutely insistent that the documentation be done, and we studied it and triple studied it. That wreck out there is Mary Celeste.
Now, I think, say they were in a boat and the line parted and they just got lost on the desert of the sea. But I think one of the most amazing maritime stories is overshadowed by the circumstances that created it. And it was William Bligh navigating so far across with his the people that were loyal to him, which was HMS Bounty, the infamous story. But I think the most harrowing part of that was William Bligh navigating, a small boat over 1,000 miles, in a very, very unforgiving part of the ocean, and he made it. Did you ever do any work on the burnt wreck of the Bounty sitting at Pitcairn Island?
No, went to Pitcairn once with Cussler, actually, and our wives. Saw the anchor, but met the descendants, but saw fragments of Bounty in their museum at Pitcairn, but no, did not work on it. There's not much. They salvaged a great deal and then burned what was left, and it's a nasty spot to dive. They pointed out where it was, but nah.
Yeah, I guess that can be a problem if you're diving and you're in the wrong part of the island, leeward or windward or wherever. That creates bad conditions or very dangerous conditions on the ocean floor. Mm-hmm. How hard is that with ROVs? So you're sending your little robot down and into a shipwreck. And I remember they had problems with this with Titanic, that you go inside there with those ROVs and they can get their cables cut and, and things like that. So how confounding is that in archaeology when you're using remote vehicles?
It can be. That's why, as a general rule, we don't send them inside. Now, I did send one inside the Yorktown a few months back, but that's because we had we didn't have to go under an overhead far. In one case, we went on the side into one of the doors was up, and we went in, and that's where we found the 2 dive bombers. But earlier, we dropped down through the open elevator and down into the space into the hangar deck where we found the mural that we knew it existed, but nobody had had a clear view of it since 1942, of the world voyages of Yorktown, as well as a wing that was stowed there. And the one big discovery that made everybody, the biggest amount of news that came out of that entire expedition on the Yorktown was the fact that we found a car inside the hangar deck. So it's easier to do that, even if you're miles deep, if you've got a really good team and you've carefully looked at it, and yes.
Are you convinced that James Cameron found the remains of one of the cars in Titanic that was being shipped?
I think I've seen imagery actually of that one in the forward hold. Yeah.
Yeah, it looked like
Billy
he actually
Carter's
found.
car.
Yeah, I actually found it. Now, off the wall question.
No handprint on the glass, though.
No handprint. No, that was. But
Yeah.
well, he might have put one there. But you probably need to do that in rubber. But in regards to weird shipwrecks, dangerous ones, and I'm specifically talking about the wrecks that are littering nuclear test sites like the atolls of Bikini Atoll. And some of those shipwrecks are famous. I know the U.S. got, at the end of World War II, two ships, one from Japan, surviving ships, and one from Germany, and brought them into the Navy and then ended up sinking them in a nuclear test. What value is there to searching out those, or were they cleaned beforehand? And two, can you do it because they may still have radioactivity?
Well, when I was in the government, U.S. government and Park Service, we went out to Bikini in 1989 and 1990 and dived a number of those wrecks, along with the U.S. Navy and contractors from Holmes and Narver who were working for the Department of Energy. The question there was Bikini, of course, as the site not just of the first two atomic tests of Able and Baker in July of 1946, but subsequent other detonations, including the largest hydrogen weapon fired off on the surface, the Castle Bravo test. The Bikinians could never come home permanently, but the idea was to see about dive tourism opening up, as is the case with Chuk, formerly known as Truk Lagoon. So we went out to assess that, working with Bikinians and diving with Bikinians, and as well as the other government folks. The ships are not radioactive themselves. There's the possibility of probably a little tiny piece of unfissioned plutonium somewhere here or there, but the Defense Nuclear Agency guys, when we did all the assessments, said it would be highly unlikely we'd find something, and even then we'd have to rest our hand on that railing right over that spot for a problem to happen, and probably be there longer than we would be if we were, standing on the surface, but with air and limited time. I mean, some of these wrecks are at 180 feet, and we were diving on air back in those days. So you had limited time and a lot of decompression. So no, we went inside those wrecks. We dived inside the USS Saratoga, famous carrier CV-3, the Japanese battleship Nagato, that had been pre-war and had been the flagship of the Ringo Kentai and had been the ship on which Admiral Yamamoto had planned and then listened to the radio broadcast from the team on the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese cruiser Sakawa was also there. The battleship Arkansas, the attack transports Gilliam and Carlisle, the submarines Apagon and Pilotfish, an advanced repair dry dock made of concrete, ARDC-13, a yard oiler, YO-60, and so on. We dived and looked at a number of those, as well as the destroyers Lamson and subsequently Anderson. The ships evidenced a fair amount of damage from the A-bomb tests, but more to the point, what people found compelling, and the islands did ultimately open up to dive tourism, with the Bikinians making the money off of that, was for people that wanted to see iconic warships. Most recently, the analysis has shifted to how much oil is left, because some of them are leaking. But it remains one of those premier, Mount Everest style dive sites, though nobody has died in diving at Bikini. Amazing sites, amazing wrecks. I've been fortunate to be there a few times and look at them. And then subsequently, from some of the other wrecks from Bikini that made it out, we were able to find exactly where the Navy sank the battleship Nevada of Pearl Harbor, and subsequent fame, and then also the target ship for the Operation Crossroads Able test, as well as the aircraft carrier Independence, which sits off the coast of California. So not much in terms of a nuclear legacy per se, other than a visual and highly illustrative view of what small yield nuclear weapons can do, but also, again, ghost ships from the dawn of the atomic age. Uh, powerful, powerful sites.
As I recall, dealing with the fuel oil of these things, which the Arizona is still leaking, you can go out into the memorial and see, oil droplets. And as I remember, might have been the Blucher, but the Norwegians had to drain a bunch of oil from, a World War II German cruiser that when the invasion of Norway happened,
Yeah.
that they sunk with, oddly, Austro-Hungarian Empire torpedoes from 50, 60 years before, but they still got it.
Right.
How bad is that as far as environmental damage from our modern ships? I wouldn't imagine a wooden ship would be a problem, but what about modern ships and damaging the oceans and ecosystems?
It's one thing if it's far out at sea. The biggest, and it's still not good, but the biggest problem are when you have wrecks in an atoll, in an island community, and remediation does take place. I mean, former oiler USS Mississinawa out at Ulithi had to be um, remediated because it was leaking oil, and if it had catastrophically released, it would have wiped out the fishery on which these people rely on as their main source of protein. You find this as well in other communities. An oil release at Bikini would be very, very catastrophic, particularly not just for the reef life but also the other marine life that's there, and including it's a shark habitat. Um, so it wouldn't be good for them. Likewise, at Chuk, one of those wrecks has started to leak, and that's bad because here you have a community. Overall, a number of these wrecks, now referred to as slicking time bombs, do pose a problem because if you've got a catastrophic release, in some cases, you're getting up with some of these larger vessels to about the amounts that were released with, say, the Exxon Valdez.
That much.
That much.
That was, well, I remember it directly. That was, I mean, they were washing the birds. I mean, it was, oof. Now, how easy is it to drain them? Drill a hole in there and drain whatever you can anyway from the tanks in those sunken ships.
It's gotten a lot easier. And I've been party to some of those discussions and to a couple of the projects where that has been done. There's some great companies that know how to do that. They're skilled. There's nary a leak. And what happens is there's a fund that Congress set aside years ago that the Coast Guard administers that deals with this when it happens. I oversaw a portion of the studies that were done by the government years ago that looked at all of the potentially polluting wrecks in U.S. waters and then shifted that down from the thousands to 89 that posed likely the greatest risk and why. Subsequently, we went out and did analysis of some of these wrecks when we found them and were able to say this one remains a problem, but this one's not. And with that, a few of them have been remediated since. One of the more famous ones is a tanker called the Coimbra, which was off New York that was definitely starting to leak, and that was successfully remediated without a problem.
Now, to switch gears, submarines, and we have many submarines sunk everywhere, but one in particular was the first submarine, as I recall, the H.L. Hunley. Mm-hmm. And this was a American Civil War submarine that went and did damage to a ship and then sank for unknown reasons. Do we know why the Hunley sank? And this gets into personal stories because we know who those people were that we found in that submarine. Tell us the story.
Well, the Hunley, the idea of submarines goes back to the late, 18th century. There's a beautiful model of a small workable submarine in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And while the model is a wind-up toy, it would have been a working craft. But the key problem isn't just propulsion; it's air refreshing mechanisms, things of that sort. Ultimately, it's the mid-19th century when a great period of experimentation leads to the development of specific craft that can do this. Some for salvage, others for military purposes. Hunley was designed to essentially be a stealthy, just submerged, not deep diving craft that was propelled by men cranking to move the propeller, with refreshing the air as best they could, but they couldn't bottle air. They were basically trying to get rid of some of they'd sprinkle, anyway, I won't get into all the science, but you could go for a while. The torpedo in this case is a bomb that's attached at the end of a spar at the bow, and they come up to the USS Housatonic, blockading Port of Charleston, and light that thing off. There's a lot of discussion over whether or not the shock of that stunned, if not killed, the crew. The crew on board the Housatonic and others said that they saw the craft moving off. Whether it was drifting or these guys were still navigating it, hard to say. But the suspicion is that the charge did not. I mean, they felt it, and it probably, maybe the ears were ringing. It probably hurt, but did it kill them? Maybe not. Probably not, actually. Though there are those who argue it did, and I'm not here to argue one or the other. The vessel was found off a ways from the wreck of the Housatonic, which is still in the bottom, and the evidence inside shows the guys were all basically there in their positions. As to whether they died instantly or later, when the sub was ultimately raised from where it had sunk there, discovered by guys brought in by Clive Cussler, and funded by Clive. The bodies were still clothed, skeletal, but still clothed. And with that, knowing their names, but learning more about them, reconstructing what they looked like through forensic work, building off of their intact casts of their intact skulls, ultimately burying those guys ashore. And then Hunley itself undergoing treatment, expensive treatment, so that it can be displayed, has all been part of that story. But the whole saga of submarines is craft that work under the water for a variety of reasons, and most famously for war, has been one that's fascinated me. And I've been able to work on a number of these sites, including another submarine from that time that actually, with pressurized air, allowed you to open the bottom so that you could do salvage, set undersea explosives, or in this case, pick up oysters and harvest pearls from them off of the coast of Panama, to early military craft up to more modern, World War II subs. Looked at a number of those, and that, I think, again, reminders of just how ingenious we can be. Usually when we're trying to figure out ways to hurt each other, but no, just the ingenuity of people to create these craft and to work with them, regardless of purpose. Submarines are a great area of study, and I've been proud to have been able to work on a few of them.
Now with Hunley, though, could it simply have been that when it bombed Housatonic, could it simply have just damaged the structure of the submarine itself, where there might be evidence of that if it actually caused the submarine itself to take on water? And at that depth, I wouldn't imagine there's not much that much pressure. It's not like the Titan with Titanic, where instantaneous implosion. What was that like? How long? I mean, it was a small sub, and I mean, if it was just damaged, but I guess the submariners would not have been in their positions.
No, these guys they basically died sitting in their benches. Dixon, the commander, was forward in his position, lying there where he had likely, detonated the charge, and yet they'd moved off a ways from Housatonic. These guys died. The sense that team that excavated shared with me is that these guys just probably went to sleep when the oxygen ran out.
Yeah, carbon dioxide poisoning, and that's it. It's sort of like the hypothermia. You go to sleep.
There's worse ways to go.
There are worse ways to go, yeah. Now, ship preservation. And I know that I read a paper that you did regarding a ship. I think it's called the Vicar of Bray. The Falkland Islands has an unusual amount of weird preserved ships that are partly sunk but not completely, and they're sitting there, and some of them are very old. What about preservation of that stuff? Because I know they hauled one of them out, took it to Great Britain, one of Brunel's ships, and restored that. Do you have any hope that some of those other ships that are in the Falklands will be restored, or won't there be interest because they were merchant ships that got abandoned and things like that?
Well, they all have interesting stories, but none of them are great icons that speak to national glory or valor and sacrifice. I mean, they're hardworking craft. The Falklands were always seen as a great outdoor museum, which, thanks to the subantarctic conditions, these wooden vessels, were very well preserved. Climate change has changed that as well. The work we did on Vicar of Bray found that where previously marine borers that eat wood had not been there, warming seas and other things had brought them there the to the Falklands, and Vicar of Bray had been infested and slowly breaking apart. So these intact hulks, this amazing place with some of these ships, including a packet ship of transatlantic immigration from the 1850s, 1840s British trading vessel, and others, they're just going to pieces now. Again, another sign of how much the Earth is changing at this stage in our history.
The North American Great Lakes, freshwater, we're not dealing with salt water. It also preserves wrecks. And a number of them have been found, including some very, very well preserved ones. Again, you see the stern gallery and things like that, and the figurehead, and things like that. What is the state of underwater archaeology in the Great Lakes right now?
There's great work being done in the Great Lakes, so whether it's in some of the states, and there's a whole range of colleagues. Let me just start by saying it's not just the shipwrecks. Based on the work of some colleagues, John O'Shea, Ashley Lemke, and others, a great deal of the prehistoric history, when it was dry land and people were hunting and building stone walls and blinds so that they could hunt migrating herds of animals, that's emerging virtually from the depths. But the shipwrecks, the oldest wreck, LaSalle's not yet been found, but a large number of other wrecks have been found and documented, many by pioneering wreck divers and explorers, as well as archaeologists. Some of these sit in national marine sanctuaries where they're available to be dived and explored. Work in some of the states has done a great deal. I just can't say enough about some of those programs in all of those lakes. My sense, having dived on a number of them, and I've dived in, I guess I've dived in 4 of the lakes on wrecks, is that, again, it's amazing to see. With that, I'm going to just go to a wreck in a lake that I will always stick with me, and that is a wreck that is from the Klondike Gold Rush, that is in the fabled Lake LaBarge up in the Yukon. And this vessel, the AJ Goddard, an iron-hulled steamer, was hauled in pieces up the Chilkoot Trail on backs of men and mules and reassembled to navigate Lake LaBarge to then connect through the rivers and to the other vessels that would take people on to Dawson City and beyond, to moil for gold, as Robert Service would say. Lake LaBarge is probably best known because of Service and his poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee, based on another wreck whose boiler still sits above the water, and a boiler in which I peered into, but found no trace of McGee. But back to it, the AJ Goddard sank in a storm. I was there after colleagues had a good solid sonar hit that they thought was it. An expedition was mounted. We flew up there, landed in a seaplane, pitched our camp, and with the gear we brought, then dived. And we were the first to see that vessel since it had slipped beneath the waves in a wintry storm. The boots of the guys that had been on, that they'd kicked off as they tried to swim free, and one guy died, but the others made it. Their boots were still alongside the wreck on the riverbed, the lake bed. The hull was intact, still slightly rusty, but rivets still delineated. The wooden superstructure had lifted off in part because of the sinking. The boiler door was open and the firewood was still inside and charred. There was a blacksmith's hearth and tools still lying there, but also strapped down on a table was a gramophone, and next to it, there was still a record on, as well as others alongside. Just an amazing, amazing ghost ship, perfectly preserved in many ways by those cold subarctic freshwater settings that you have for wrecks like that. Just unbelievable. And again, a reminder for me of just how amazing it is where you go in places like that and you see history so well preserved.
I wonder what the record was, because
One
sometimes
one of
could you
them was
read it?
identified. One of them was identified, and I can't remember the name, but it was a well-known song at the time, but there's no surviving recording of it. The other record that was identified, come to think of it, they do have a recording of it. Not from that actual record, but somebody had recorded that song, and it's in the archives. And so, yeah, the records weren't so well preserved. I mean, they were conserved. They were raised and treated, and they're on display in the Yukon, but you wouldn't play them.
Unfortunate, but then again, that's organic material, and that gets
Yeah.
questionable. My last question for you is this: the unknown, the unfound. What are the greatest shipwrecks that remain, historically speaking, that we have not yet found? Because we found a ton of them, because a lot of rich people go out looking for them and all this. What's left that what would you most like to find as far as historic shipwrecks that no one knows where they're at?
There's a number of wrecks, of course, that have famous names that are attached that simply sailed away and went missing. There's lost ships from the war that still remain to be found. Rather than give you a list of names, or even just one, here's where I'm going to say it matters the most to me at this stage in my career. It's those wrecks that speak to the everyday experience, but also to loss. It's the wrecks that can bring closure to families. Tim Taylor and his wife Valerie are doing great work with their team to find all of the U.S. submarines lost in World War II as a means of bringing closure to families. That's important work. There's other projects like that that are doing this. And with that, we may not always know who they are, but in some cases, when we find certain types of wrecks, particularly as deep sea surveys locate them, you don't necessarily need a name to know that what you're seeing had a profound impact on people home ashore. MH370's loss and searching for that found two older British vessels, one of which an iron-built vessel, likely a coal carrier, speaks powerfully to later days of sail when the only jobs you could get were basically tramping these out to carry bulk cargoes and dangerous cargoes like coal, which if loaded wet can catch fire. And I've read numbers of accounts and letters of families who said their son was a brass bounder. He's an apprentice on one of these British 3-4 masted ships, leaving Newcastle, sailing across the Pacific and on their way from Australia or New Zealand and go around the Horn. And they just never hear from them again. This vessel is likely one of those types of ships. Another wreck that we worked on was a small fishing craft that was found during a survey and placing scientific instruments off of the east coast of South Carolina at Blake Ridge, Blake Plateau. And we studied it and were able to identify it as a small, probably 3, maybe 4 crew member fishing smack, a wet well smack, which means the forward hold has holes bored in it and watertight bulkheads so that you keep your catch fresh to sell at market. Just a couple guys working in this and just a few folks And this wreck is 199 miles off the coast at the edge of the Gulf Stream and was caught in a storm. And you could see that it capsized, the anchor played out, and it hit the bottom with the anchor stretched off to one side and struck with such force that the ballast broke the hull. Much of that wood is gone, but you could still see where everything was, and that's how we were able to determine what type of ship it was, with the straps that held the mast still in place, built sometime probably around 1840 and lost probably before the Civil War. Personal items, including a guy's little handmade kit known as a sailor's wife. And one of these was found with the Franklin expedition, guys. If you are sailing and you're a guy who just lives at sea, quote unquote, a sailor's wife is brass buttons. It's spools of thread. It's needles. It's all that you need to mend your own clothes. And so with that, a reminder, none of these guys made it. And so here they are, and they die in probably a storm, a hurricane that swept them far out to sea. And with that, never seen. We don't know who they were, but after we announced that find, a woman wrote to say she wondered because she and her family had a story of an ancestor who sailed in such a fashion coming out of Havana and was never seen again, and they always thought somewhere out there he would lie. More of those types of things are what I'd like to see found. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today, and thank you so much for the invitation to share more about this, and as well to share some of what we talked about in the book. It was a labor of love based on a lot of years of research, and as you can tell, I'm not done yet, but the time had come to put some of these tales down.
Everybody should check out The Great Museum of the Sea by James Delgado. And Jim, thank you for joining us. This was fascinating, and I hope we can do it again sometime, because I can talk about oceans for forever.
Okay. Thank you.